Good afternoon, class. In today's video, what I'd like to do is continue the topic of chess, and we're going to move on to how each of these pieces move. So in the next series, I'm going to go over how the pawn moves, the queen, the bishop, the knight, and the rook, how all of these will move. And this time I figured I'd keep it focused on the board because that's probably what we're here to see. So, again, let's make sure we feature all these pieces. This is the pawn. This is the queen. This piece is the bishop. This piece is the knight. And this piece is the rook. And in each section, I'll go over how each of these pieces moves and what their powers are. So let's start with the pawn. The pawn is a fairly unique piece. It is, for all intents and purposes, it's pretty weak in terms of its actual powers, but it does play structural importance as well as strategic importance later on towards the end of the game. The pawn can move on the first of its moves. It can move 1 or 2 spaces, as indicated by these two purple squares here. That's its a reach in terms of lateral movement. These yellow squares are to denote that it has influence over here as well. Because, for example, if there is a black piece and it is right over here, it is within the pawn's sphere of influence to capture diagonally, like so. So that is one of the ways that the pawn can be utilized. However, once this pawn has made its first move, so let's say it's moved up 2 already, its sphere of influence in terms of for its next move, it can still threaten these 2 squares right here, and it can only move forward to this 1 square. So, however, this part is where it gets a little bit tricky, because if there is another piece, let's say this black pawn, that blocks this pawn over here, this white pawn can move this way, or diagonally to the left or to the right, utilizing its influence of capturing. However, moving forward, it cannot do so anymore because there is a piece in the way. It doesn't matter if it's another pawn, if it's any other piece, it could be even its own piece. This pawn can no longer move forward because it is being blocked. There's an obstruction to that piece, to the pawn's movement. It can still capture to the sides, but it cannot it cannot move forward, and it cannot capture in this square because it has now been occupied. Okay? So with that, what I'd like to do is to go over the most interesting thing about a pawn, though, is that pawns can only move forward. So they can only keep going 1 move at a time. But should a pawn ever reach this last row, this 8th row, it cannot move any further forward because that's the end of the board. So there is a special provision in chess where it can turn into any one of these power pieces. So this is called promotion. So in this case, the pawn can either promote to a queen, a bishop, a knight, or a rook. And you would swap out the pawn for whichever one you want, like so. So that's how a pawn moves. In the next section, we'll go over how the queen moves. This is the queen, and when the queen is your most powerful piece. What happens with the queen is that, and this is why the queen is the most powerful piece. Do you see where all of these purple squares are? All of these squares are her area of influence. As long as there is no obstruction between the queen and wherever the location that she is going to is. For example, if there's a pawn here, the queen cannot jump over this piece and do that. That is not allowed. But anywhere within these purple squares, this is where the queen can move if there is no obstruction. So if the queen wanted to move from here to here, she could, if there is no obstruction. However, that means if there's a pawn here, the queen can move up to here, or capture that piece right there. Unfortunately, that's where her move ends, and that's where the piece will stop. However, this is what also makes the queen such a powerful piece. However, you also only get one of those queens, so this makes her while it makes the queen very, very powerful, it also makes the queen very, very vulnerable. And for most strategies, the recommendation is to keep your queen in the back row until everything else is a little bit more developed and you're ready to move forward with your attack. This is the bishop. It can move along the diagonal that it started out with. So if it's on a dark colored square, it's a dark colored bishop. If it's on a light colored square, it can only move on light colored squares afterwards. Its sphere of influence is very large actually as well. It can move almost all the way across the board along the diagonal, so long as there's not an obstruction. For example, if there is a pawn right over here, the bishop cannot go all the way over here. That would include it jumping a piece. That is not allowed. However, it can move here, or it can move here on its move up to that square, up to the obstruction, and capture it. So that would be how a bishop moves. And as you can see, the biggest range of influence for the bishop, I'd like to point out, is right here on what we call the long diagonal. So that's that's a little first glimpse of a strategy when it comes to how to strategize in chess. This is the knight. It can move in an L shape. So it can either move in an L shape, meaning it can go 1, 2, and across, or it can go 1 and then 2 across. So that's the sphere of influence that a knight can utilize. This piece is unusual in that it is the only piece that is allowed to jump. So for example, let's say I have a pawn right over here for convenience sake. This does not restrict the knight from moving over to this square or to this square. The knight, even though the knight's path will take it through the pawn, it acts as if it jumps over that pawn. This knight is the only piece that can do that. Every other piece would get stopped by something in its way. Or even if this pawn was over here, you'd think that, oh, maybe it can't get past because it's blocking the knight's path. No, the knight can jump over that, and that's still okay. So the knight is unusual in this regard. It is also seen as one that can work towards different strategies. It's a little bit more of a trickier piece to deal with. Some people say it's not as powerful as a bishop because it doesn't, as you can clearly see, it doesn't have that much range. But also the thing I'd like to point out is the knight is most powerful in the middle of the board. If you put the knight over here, for example, all of a sudden the knight's range becomes, basically you've cut the knight's range in about half. So you don't really want the knight in the corner over here unless you have to, or it's part of your strategy. You really want the knight right here in the middle where it has the most range to attack. So that is how the knight moves. This is the rook. And for the rook, it's your second most powerful piece. What it can do is it can move along the columns or along the rows as many spaces as it is unimpeded, if there's no obstacle. So for example, if there is a pawn right over here, the rook cannot jump, like I've said before. It can go here, but it cannot go behind this pawn. It must go only up to the point where it captures the pawn. So for the rook's range is limited in that regard. It cannot jump like a knight or anything like that, but it does have complete freedom horizontally and vertically, at least according to the orientation of this chessboard. So that is how the rook moves. It also has one extra, there is a special move that goes along with this rook. So I can show that in a future video, but just know that there is one more special move that this rook actually has that you will pretty much utilize in every game of chess. Finally, this is the king. This is the most important piece of all the chess pieces on the board. If this piece is lost or it cannot move anymore and is under threat, that is called checkmate and the game is over. So for this king, the king can move in any direction but only one square. There is, however, there is one exception to this, and this is where I will get into that in the next section when I talk about special moves that you could possibly do. This one is more of, the next section will be more of a special move that you will do generally in every game because it's good strategy, but otherwise I'll save those types of moves for tactics and the like in the next series of videos. So for this last section, what I thought I'd do is I go over this term called castling. It is something that you will do pretty much in every game because it is really, really powerful, because the number one thing you want to remember in chess is that king safety is the most important thing. If you lose your king, that's it, game over, you lose. So in this one, what we do is we don't want the king to be in the center because that's a very vulnerable place for the king to be. We want the king to be off to the side of the board, either on this side or on this side. So what we'll do is we'll take the king, and if the king has not moved at all in this game, it is allowed to do this. But the condition is two things must be fulfilled. The first is that this king this must be the king's first move, and it must be this rook's first move as well. If this rook has moved, the king can no longer castle on this side. However, if this rook has not moved, the king can castle on this side. So let's talk about the two types of castling that you might hear. There is what we call short castling on the king side and long castling on the queen side. It's a little bit harder to queen side castle because you have three pieces that you have to get out of the way first, whereas you only need two pieces to get out of the way for the king side to castle. So let's look at that. What does that look like? This is the one time that the king is allowed to move two squares. So the king will move two squares and the rook will jump over. This is what we call castling on the king side. If we reset, we can also do the same thing on the queen side. What we do is we move the king over two squares and the rook over basically three squares and have it hop over. This is castling on the queen side, or we would call this the long castle. So these two moves are very important, and that's why I put them in the how pieces move, because this combination of how to move the rooks and the kings are very, very important. You will do this pretty much every game. It is the exception rather than the rule to not castle, because castling is that powerful. So study hard, and I'll see you guys in the next video.